In the greater narrative of the Second World War, the 12th of March 1938 goes down as a significant turning point in the road to war. The German Anschluss of Austria into the Third Reich is often seen by many as the point of no return on that road to war. And we're all probably at least generally familiar with the events that took place in Austria between 1938 and 1945, but what very often gets lost in the narrative is what happened to the region at war's end. Today, we're going to look at the Austrian post-war experience and how a region of the Reich became a battleground of the Cold War as it went from Soviet and Western Allied occupation to a Western-leaning but generally neutralish country, which was to play host to not only critical top-level dialogues between East and West, but also some of the era's most fascinating tales of espionage. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. So 1943 saw the Allies agree at the Moscow Conference that Austria was an unwilling part of the Axis coalition, a nation subject to Nazi aggression. Combined with this agreement was a stated intent to restore Austrian independence. Now, I can already hear the comment section exploding regarding Austrian complicity in the horrors of the Second World War. So, to quote directly from the Joint Four Nations Declaration from the Moscow Conference, Austria is reminded, however, that she has a responsibility, which she cannot evade, for participation in the war at the side of Hitlerite Germany, and that in the final settlement account will inevitably be taken of her own contribution to her liberation. Basically, the Allies wanted an independent and rehabilitated Austria, but also recognized that she had a responsibility for which she needed to atone. On March 29, 1945, troops from the Red Army crossed westward across the border and into Austria. Stalin planned on establishing a government made up of Austrian communists in exile, something we should all come to expect at this point, given the standard practice we've all seen in other occupied territories in Eastern Europe and in Asia. However, this practice didn't quite work out in Austria, as the prominent First Republic socialist politician Karl Renner reached out to the Soviets and convinced them that he should form the new government. The fact that this plan was agreed to without the consultation of the Western Allies created a rift between the Austrian government, as the Allies just didn't trust Renner, but more on that in a minute. Okay, so while Renner was setting up his government and local administration, the Soviets were also busy setting up their own apparatuses for continued influence in Austria. 1/3 of State Chancellor Renner's cabinet was composed of Austrian communists, including those crucial offices like the Secretary of State of the Interior, as well as the Secretary of State for Education. Longtime supporters of this channel will immediately recognize that similar tactics were employed in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, well, the list goes on. However, this is where the presence of Renner becomes vital. Renner actually had little interest in the Sovietization of Austria, and in order to blunt the influence of the communists in cabinet, arranged that all of their ministerial deputies were people who were not communists. So that's the Soviet occupation, but we know the Western Allies have a part to play in this too. American troops entered Austrian territory on April 26th, almost a full month later than the Red Army. British and French troops followed in the days afterwards. As I'd mentioned, the Allies didn't trust Renner, thinking him to be a puppet of the Soviets. Their distrust could be seen as a natural side effect of how he was appointed without any input from them. This feeling was magnified because the Allies had little impact, influence, or even visibility into the Soviet-occupied territory, the territory Renner was in charge of. It's important to note here that this was a two-way street though. The Soviets had little impact, influence, or visibility into the Allied areas of occupation. Now, like Germany, well, what we now consider Germany, since Austria at that point was still a part of Germany, Austria was divided into 4 zones of occupation. You can guess who, right? The Soviet zone was in the east of the territory, the French had the west, the Americans took the north, bordering along Bavaria, while the Brit-Bongers occupied the south, along the Italian border. Vienna, it was agreed, would replicate Berlin and be occupied by all four powers. Overall, the country was to be ruled by the Allied Council, made up of 4 military governors. The council at first refused to recognize Renner's legitimacy, but as a bit of time passed, the Allies became more convinced of his independence from Soviet influence. With that growing trust came a greater willingness to allow Renner to exert more government influence. Worse by Soviet economic policy. Once all the ready-made products and equipment had been removed, the Soviets began to take control of Austrian industries and firms in their zone of control. To this end, they formed USIA, the Administration for Soviet Property in Austria. At its peak, USIA controlled about 450 enterprises and had a countrywide monopoly over steel, glass, and oil, and controlled at least 5% of Austria's annual economic output. Although the Austrian government refused to recognize the legality of USIA control, the Soviets simply responded by refusing to pay taxes on USIA profits. Furthermore, those profits were simply confiscated by the Soviet Union as reparations, instead of being reinvested into those companies. So no local control over the industries, and zero tax revenue or reinvestment from them either. But it gets better. USIA was also an employer. Workers who went on strike were fired. At its strongest point in 1950, USIA employed up to 50,000 workers. Now, these industries were not strongly linked to the rest of Austria, but rather to the other Soviet-dominated socialist countries to the east. You can imagine what a complicated web this is actually creating. Of course, industrial capacity and allocation challenges weren't the only things Austria struggled with. There were also food shortages. Even as industrial output began to climb, the situation surrounding consumer goods, including food, remained dire. 65% of agricultural output came from the Soviet zone, which meant that the rest of Austria wasn't getting enough food. Through 1946 and 1947, the situation was alleviated only by aid provided by the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. A temporary resolution was achieved by means of a practice that would come to define post-war Austrian politics: consensus building. The government, the large trade unions, and large businesses came to an agreement which included a tight regulation of both food and labor markets. Effectively, wage increases were limited and locked to commodity prices through annual price-wage agreements. In 1947, the UNRRA stopped its aid in Austria. However, the harvest that year was quite poor, and unrest became prominent. Included in this was the outbreak of food riots in Vienna in May of 1947. Chancellor Fiegel blamed the communists, who he accused of trying to overthrow the government. In reality, although it's true the communists tried to leverage the situation to make political demands and turn Austria away from the West, there were objective economic issues at fault. It was only the provision of $300 million in aid during the summer of 1947 that helped quell the situation and maintain the status quo. Now, speaking of US aid, we arrive back at our old friend, the Marshall Plan. Austria was the recipient of nearly $1 billion in Marshall Plan aid. In 1948-1949, Marshall Plan aid accounted for 14% of national income, the highest ratio of any recipient nation. Austria also received nearly $500 million in humanitarian aid as well. And that's not all. The Americans also refunded the approximately $300 million that had already been levied as payment for the cost of occupation. The Americans had decided that keeping Austria out of the Soviet sphere of influence was of the utmost importance. And, well, it worked. It was really only this financial assistance that helped to stabilize a west-leaning Austria. So, Austria by the late 1940s, like its neighbor to the north, is economically stabilizing, but is under foreign occupation by two opposing factions. So why didn't we get a democratic capitalist West Austria and a communist-dominated East Austria, which, given the track record elsewhere, you would actually expect? Well, as you should expect, it's complicated. To begin with, the Allied occupation forces began to train a new Austrian military, fearing a potential communist takeover. This included the inclusion of former members of the Wehrmacht, denazification in the West at its best, right? Now, in the face of requests from Austrian communists to Joseph Stalin seeking a formal partition, Andrei Zhdanov, the man in charge of Soviet policy in Europe, favored using Austria as a bargaining chip in negotiations rather than the formation of another client state. As Europe moved into the 1950s, some significant changes occurred. The Korean War demonstrated the horrors of war yet again. Stalin died. Khrushchev emerged as the new Soviet leader, and the hints of a thaw all helped moderate relations between East and West just a little bit. Enough to allow the idea of an independent unified Austria possible anyways. It began by the military representation in Austria being replaced by a diplomatic one, coupled with a reduction in overall military forces. From a total of 700,000 troops in occupation, these numbers were reduced to approximately 20,000 Allied troops and 40,000 Soviet ones. Still sizable, but highly reduced. Probably more importantly from the Soviet perspective, the value of the USIA firms had fallen dramatically. Lack of investment and general neglect have a way of doing that, after all. Since they weren't competitive, especially against competing firms that had been set up in the western zones of occupation, there was no incentive for the Soviets to remain in Austria. In fact, by 1955, most of those businesses were either on the verge of bankruptcy or extremely heavily indebted to the Soviet military bank. Also, geopolitically, Austria was becoming less vital to the Soviet Union. The end of the conflict with Yugoslavia and the upcoming signing of the Warsaw Pact Agreement all reinforced this. Elections held in 1953 still resulted in the Grand Coalition between the People's Party and the Socialist Party. However, this time, Julius Raab, a politician who had been vetoed by the Soviets in the last election due to his right-leaning views, became the chancellor. Raab was then invited to talks in Moscow, which resulted in an agreement in principle for a unified Austrian nation. In exchange, Austria would pledge its neutrality. On the 15th of May 1955, the Austrian State Treaty was signed in Vienna between the Austrian government and the four occupying forces, recreating a fully independent Austria. Occupying troops were fully withdrawn by October 25th, and the next day, Austria signed a declaration of neutrality. Austria is often forgotten during the early Cold War story, but serves as an interesting counterpoint to the occupation of Germany, a similar starting point but a very different result. A neutral Austria, like Finland, was to become a hotbed of activity through the rest of the Cold War. The freedom that both sides had to operate there made it a center for espionage activity. It also served as the stage for some of the most significant bilateral talks held during the era. But we'll get there as we move forward in our narrative. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, including a look at the 1961 Vienna Summit, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work and want to see me eating Spätzle while wearing a Tyrolean hat, consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.